This video is entitled Data Flow Diagram Shapes and goes along with Chapter 5 or Topic 5 of our Systems Analysis and Design course at Shawnee State University. I'm Dr. Renaud, and I'll be taking you through this video presentation. We've talked about modeling, and we've talked about the idea of trying to do an analysis. One of the ways that we can analyze a system is using a technique known as the data flow diagram, or DFD for short. It's a process modeling. Instead of a use case modeling that's modeling user interaction and how they want to use the system, what we're doing with this is we're analyzing the processes of the system. Sometimes a use may use multiple processes, and sometimes um, multiple processes can become one use, or a process can be in multiple use cases also. So this is all dealing with how the data flows through the system. And that's what we're modeling here, is we're modeling the data flow and the actual processes and manipulations of that data. So this is process modeling. And we're going to discuss that data flows either from a process to a process, from a process to a sink or source, and the book calls it an entity, and I'll sometimes call it all three. So a sink would be a process that uses the data. A source would be a process that generates the data, and an entity would be a general term for a sink or source. And then data will flow from a process to a data store. So somewhere where we store the data, or from a data store back to a process. So data flows from process to entity, sink or source, and process to data store, and back and forth between those. Now, the three shapes we use on a data flow diagram, on a DFD, are the rectangle, and the rectangle represents a sink or source. It represents an entity. You can think of it as something that either is generating or consuming data, consuming a report, consuming information, consuming raw data, whatever. This is someone that's either using it, creating it, or consuming it. The process is represented by a rectangle with a bar on the top, and we're going to assign each process a unique process ID. Usually it's a process number. And then we're going to put the name of the process into the process box. So this would be a process like reconcile the checkbook, or receive an order, or do this or do that. So these would be the processes, not the use cases, but the processes that are used by the use cases. And then the last shape is a rectangle that's open on one side, and that represents a data store. And each data store also has an ID. Usually we use D1, D2, D3 to represent that it is a data store, and then the name of the data store. Now, because the data flow diagram can get really complex, you can have multiple data stores, like D1 customer can appear multiple places on the diagram, and it's all the same customer data store. Also, if you have a sink or source with a unique name, like customer or vendor, and you have that same sink or source, that same entity in multiple places on your diagram with the same name, that's the same entity, even though it shows up as separate boxes. Processes, though, you can only have a process box once for each process. But for an entity, sink source, or a data store, you can have the same box appear multiple places in the diagram to make the diagram easier to understand, but it's still the same entity and the same data store. The next part of a data flow diagram are the data flows. Wouldn't that make sense? That's why we call it a data flow diagram, because we're flowing data. Data flows on arrows. So wherever there's an arrow connecting a process to a source, a process to a sink back to a process, data is flowing on that arrow, and the arrowhead tells us which direction the data is flowing. Each arrow needs to have a name. to represent what data elements are in that flow. For instance, like a new user signs up for our web service. So it would be user, and there would be an arrow that says new sign up into the new sign up form. And that new sign up data would be name, address, email, that kind of stuff. So we could identify each of those flows by their name and by what data flows on it. Now, this is a rule. This is something that's an absolute, and many of you are going to make the mistake on your first few diagrams, but all flows must start or end at a process. So a flow from sink to source or a flow from entity to entity is not valid, because what moves the data? It takes a process to move the data, right? An entity cannot put the data directly into a data store. There needs to be a process that takes the data from the entity and puts it into a data store. So data must start or end in a process. So data can flow from process to process and back. The data can flow from a process to an entity and back. Data can flow from a process to a data store and from the data store back to the process. But it is not valid for an entity to flow data to an entity, or a data store to flow into data to another data store without a process there in the middle. And remember, a data flow is a group of data. It's a form full of data. It's a few data points. It's maybe just a single data point, but it still can represent a chunk of data flowing from one to another. We're not going to see any data flow diagrams in this first introductory video, but data flow diagrams come in multiple levels of data flow diagram. The first level is known as the context diagram and shows the entire system as one process with its external sinks and sources, its entities, and the big data that flows in and out of the system. It by all means does not, it's by no means is it all encompassing. It doesn't have all the data flows to all the entities. It doesn't have all the entities, but it kind of shows where the system fits in the universe, where the system fits in what data is flowing, big data, important data is flowing in and out of the system. The level 0 diagram is the first blow up of the system into usually 5 to 7 to 10 processes. It can have additional entities and all kinds of data flows, data stores. And then the levels 1 through whatever are, for instance, the process here in a level 0 diagram could then be blown up into sub-processes or sub-sub-processes. And we do that using the level 1 or level 2 diagram. I've never really seen anybody go beyond like a level 2 in the diagram, just because you can get so much information in a data flow diagram. You can do so much modeling, and it's all about understanding how things work. But you could, if you needed to go multiple levels of sub-processes to understand something. So the context diagram is the real high level, very low detail. It just has the system as a single process. The level 0 diagram then takes the system and breaks it up into 5 to 7 to 10 sub-processes. Well, the big processes of the system. And then the level 1 diagram would take each one of those processes, break it up into additional more processes, getting into more and more detail. This concludes the quick video on DFD shapes and kind of what a DFD is. Thank you for watching. Remember, this video is copyright 2020 by James Imrano, PhD. All rights are reserved.